Chapter 10, Mishnah 8. The previous Mishnah mentioned the Torah's prohibition against harvesting grain of the new crop before the Omer. See note 4 there. This Mishnah mentions a number of exceptions to that prohibition and addresses which activities were prohibited by the sages. We may harvest irrigated fields of the valleys whose grain is of low quality before the grain has been harvested for the Omer offering. The Torah prohibition against harvesting before the Omer does not apply to these low-quality grains, since they are unfit for the Omer offering. But we may not stack this grain until after the Omer has been offered, to ensure that the grain will not be eaten before then. The Jewish residents of Jericho, whose grain grew in irrigated fields of the valley, would harvest their grain before the Omer, with the consent of the sages who permit harvesting such field before the Omer. However, they would stack it against the wishes of the sages, who, as stated above, forbade stacking grain before the Omer was offered. Nevertheless, the sages did not protest their actions. The Mishnah cites another exception to the prohibition against harvesting before the Omer. One may harvest unripe grain before the Omer was harvested and feed the grain to an animal, because the Torah never prohibited this type of harvesting, as long as it was done for the purpose of feeding animals. The scope of this ruling is discussed. Rabbi Yehuda said, when is it permitted to cut unripe grain for animal feed before the Omer? Only when one began to harvest the grain for the animal before the grain reaches the final third of its growth. Once the grain has reached the final third of its growth, however, he may not begin cutting it before the Omer. Rabbi Shimon says one may harvest unripe grain before the Omer and feed it to an animal, even after the grain has reached a third of its growth.